The room was drowning in gold, champagne flutes clinking like broken promises, diamonds winking under chandeliers heavier than a man's conscience, laughter so loud it could drown out the sound of a heart breaking. And then, without warning, the music stopped. Not a fade, not a stutter. Just silence so sudden it felt like the world had been unplugged. Every head turned, every breath held. Because standing in the doorway, small enough to slip through the cracks of this gilded cage, was a child. Not just any child, an orphan, dressed in clothes that had known more patches than warmth, her bare feet silent against the marble floors that had never felt the weight of anything so fragile. The millionaire at the center of it all, his tailored suit still smelling of new money, his smirk frozen mid-boast, felt something shift in the air. The girl's eyes locked onto his, dark and unblinking, like she wasn't just seeing him but through him. And then she spoke. 3 words. 3 words that turned the blood in his veins to ice. Nobody moved. Not the socialites with their hollow smiles, not the bodyguards paid to keep the wrong kind of people out, not even the waiters balancing trays of caviar that suddenly tasted like ash, because the girl wasn't there for the food or the money or the pity. She was there for something the millionaire had spent a lifetime pretending didn't exist. A debt. A secret. A sin so old he thought it had been buried with the past. But the past, as it turns out, has a way of walking right through the front door when you least expect it. And this time, it wasn't knocking. It was staring him down, daring him to remember. What did she say? What could a child possibly know that would make a room full of the most powerful people in the city feel like they'd just been sentenced? And why did the millionaire's hands start to shake the second their eyes met? The answer is waiting at the end of this story, but only if you stay until the last second. Because some truths, they're not just hard to hear, they're impossible to unhear. If you want to know what happens next, smash that like button, hit subscribe, and turn on the bell. Because this is the kind of story that doesn't just end. It haunts. And trust me, you don't want to miss what comes after the silence. The girl didn't belong here. That much was obvious from the way the light seemed to bend around her, like even the chandeliers were reluctant to illuminate something so out of place. She was a smudge of gray in a world of gold, a world that had spent decades polishing its edges so sharp they could cut anyone who dared to touch them. And yet, there she stood, her thin shoulders squared beneath a dress that had been stitched together from the scraps of someone else's charity. Her hair, the color of dried autumn leaves, was tangled just enough to tell you no one had brushed it in days. But her eyes, that was where the storm lived. Not the kind of storm that raged and screamed, but the kind that settled into your bones, quiet and unshakable, the kind that made the millionaire's fingers twitch around his whiskey glass like he was trying to strangle the ice inside it. The room was still holding its breath, every guest frozen mid-sip, mid-laugh, mid-lie. They had all mastered the art of looking without seeing, of hearing without listening. But tonight, that skill had abandoned them. Because the girl wasn't just looking at the millionaire. She was looking through him, past the tailored suit, past the cold smile, past the carefully constructed myth of the self-made man. And for the first time in his life, the millionaire felt the weight of his own gaze being returned. Not with fear, not with awe, but with something far worse. Recognition. The guests began to shift, uncomfortable. A woman in a gown that cost more than the girl's entire orphanage clutched her pearls a little tighter. A man in a Rolex cleared his throat, his eyes darting between the child and the exit, as if he could already sense the scandal brewing. But the millionaire, he didn't move. He couldn't. Because the girl had started walking toward him, her steps small but unhurried, like she had every right to be there. Like she had been waiting for this moment for years. And then she stopped. Right in front of him. Close enough that he could see the faint scar above her eyebrow, the kind that came from a fall no one had been there to catch. Close enough that he could smell the faint scent of rain and old books clinging to her skin. Close enough that when she reached into the pocket of her dress, every muscle in his body tensed like a coiled spring. She pulled out a photograph. Not a pristine, glossy print, but a creased, faded thing. the edges worn soft from being handled too many times. And when she held it up, the millionaire's face went pale. Not the kind of pale that came from shock, but the kind that came from being confronted with a ghost. The photograph was of a woman with the same sharp cheekbones as the girl, the same stubborn set to her jaw. A woman who had once stood in this very room, her hands calloused from scrubbing floors that had never thanked her, her back bent from carrying the weight of a man's ego who had never once carried her in return. The millionaire's former housekeeper, the one he had fired on a whim, the one he had left to rot in the streets when she dared to ask for a raise to feed her daughter. The one who had died in a hospital bed 3 winters ago, her last words a name, his name, whispered to a child too young to understand why the world had turned its back on them both. The girl's voice, when it came, was steady, not the tremble of a child begging for scraps, but the quiet certainty of someone who had already lost everything and had nothing left to fear. She told me you'd remember her. A beat, a breath. The sound of 100 guests leaning in, their own sins suddenly feeling heavier in their pockets. But she also told me you'd lie about it. The millionaire's jaw tightened. He could feel the eyes of his peers burning into him, their curiosity morphing into something uglier, something hungrier. The vultures had smelled blood in the water. And the girl? She wasn't done, not even close. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, in shaky, faded ink, were words. Words that made the millionaire's stomach drop like a stone. Words that were going to unravel everything. But before she could read them aloud, before the room could erupt into the kind of chaos that ruined reputations and ended careers, the girl's gaze flicked past the millionaire's shoulder, to the man standing just behind him, the millionaire's lawyer, the one who had drawn up the papers that left the housekeeper with nothing, the one who had whispered in his ear that night, "Let her go. No one will remember her by morning." The lawyer's face was a mask of calm, but his fingers betrayed him, twitching toward his phone like he was already calculating damage control. The girl smiled, not the smile of a child who had been given a gift, but the smile of someone who had just been handed a weapon. And then she spoke again. "You should have burned the letter." Silence, the kind of silence that came before a storm, the kind that promised nothing would ever be the same. The millionaire's mind raced. What letter? What had she found? But deep down, he already knew. Because there was only one letter that could make a man like him feel the cold sweat of fear trickling down his spine. The letter his housekeeper had written the day she was fired. The letter she had sworn to deliver no matter what. And now, here it was, in the hands of her daughter. The room was a powder keg. One word from the girl, and it would explode. One name, one date, one truth he had buried so deep he thought it would never see the light. But the girl wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the guests, at the sea of faces who had spent their lives pretending they were better than the people who served them. And when she spoke again, her voice was loud enough to carry, loud enough to make sure no one could look away. "My mother worked for this man for 15 years. Her fingers tightened around the photograph. She cleaned his floors. She raised his children when he was too busy counting his money. And when she got sick, when she couldn't work fast enough, when she dared to ask for help, he threw her out like garbage." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The millionaire's hands clenched into fists. He could stop this. He could have her removed. He could spin this, bury it, make sure no one ever spoke of it again. But the girl wasn't finished. She died believing he would do the right thing. Her voice didn't waver. She died waiting for him to remember her name. The millionaire's chest burned. He could feel the weight of the past pressing down on him, the ghosts of choices he had made and never once regretted. Until now. The girl lifted her chin. "But I'm not my mother." And then she read the first line of the letter. The room erupted. But the millionaire? He didn't hear any of it. Because the only sound left was the pounding of his own heart, and the echo of a question he had spent a lifetime avoiding. "What did you do?" The girl's voice cut through the noise like a blade. The first line of the letter wasn't just words. It was a detonation. I know what you did to the ledgers in '98. The room, already tense, seemed to tilt on its axis. The millionaire's face went slack, his carefully constructed mask slipping for the first time in decades. Because those weren't just words. They were a key to a vault he had spent years pretending didn't exist. The guests who moments ago had been shifting uncomfortably now stood frozen. The ledgers. The ledgers. Whispers slithered through the crowd like serpents. The millionaire's empire hadn't been built on hard work alone. Everyone in that room knew it. But the details, the proof, that was something else entirely. And now, a child, this child, was holding it in her hands. The girl didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence was her amplifier. My mother kept everything, she said, her fingers tracing the faded ink of the letter. Every receipt, every contract, every time you told her to lose a document so the taxman wouldn't see it. She looked up, her gaze locking onto the millionaire's like a vice. She thought it was insurance, a way to make sure you'd take care of me if anything happened to her. A bitter laugh, too old for her years, escaped her lips. But you didn't, did you? The millionaire's lawyer stepped forward, his face a polished mask of indifference, but his eyes betrayed him, sharp, calculating. This is absurd, he said, his voice smooth as oil. A child's fantasy. There's no proof. The girl cut him off with a single motion. She reached into her pocket again. This time she pulled out a small, worn leather notebook, the kind accountants used before everything went digital, the kind that could hold names, dates, numbers, evidence. The millionaire's breath hitched. He recognized that notebook. He had given it to the housekeeper years ago, joking that she could keep track of her little chores in it. Never in a million years did he think she'd use it to keep track of his. The girl flipped it open. Page 17, she said, her voice steady. The transfer to the Cayman account, the one that doesn't exist on paper. She turned another page. Page 23. The bribe to the city inspector to ignore the building violations at your downtown property. Another page. Page 41. The names of the employees you fired after they asked for fair wages, including my mother. The room was a tinderbox, one spark, and the millionaire's entire world would go up in flames. His reputation, his business, his legacy. And the girl? She wasn't just holding a notebook, she was holding a match. The millionaire's hands trembled. For the first time in his life, he felt the cold grip of fear. Not the thrill of risk, but the paralyzing terror of exposure. He had spent decades outrunning his past, burying his mistakes under layers of money and power. But here it was, standing in front of him in a dress 2 sizes too big, her eyes burning with a fire he couldn't extinguish. You can stop me, the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. You can have your men drag me out of here. You can call me a liar. You can do everything you've always done to people like me. She took a step closer. But you can't make them unhear the truth. The millionaire's lawyer lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab the notebook. But the girl was faster. She snapped it shut and held it to her chest, her small frame suddenly radiating a strength that made the lawyer hesitate. The guests were watching now, their expressions a mix of horror and fascination. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a reckoning. And then the girl did something no one expected. She knelt, right there in the middle of the ballroom on the same marble floors her mother had scrubbed until her knees bled. She placed the notebook and the letter on the ground and slid them across the floor toward the millionaire. I don't want your money, she said, her voice ringing clear in the stunned silence. I want you to look at me, really look at me, and tell me my mother's life didn't matter. The millionaire's chest constricted. He could see his reflection in the girl's eyes, not the man he had spent years crafting, but the man he had tried to forget. The one who had fired a sick woman because she was too slow. The one who had turned his back on a child because it was easier than facing his own guilt. The guests were holding their breath. The lawyer was whispering urgently in the millionaire's ear, his voice a frantic hiss. Say something. Deny it. Do something. But the millionaire couldn't move. Because the girl had reached into her pocket one last time, and this time what she pulled out wasn't paper. It was a small, tarnished locket, the kind that held photographs, the kind that was meant to be cherished. She opened it, and the millionaire's world stopped. Inside was a picture of him. Not the man he was now, but the man he had been 20 years ago. Younger, softer, standing beside the girl's mother. They were smiling, together. The kind of smile that didn't belong in boardrooms or press releases. The kind of smile that was real. The girl's voice was barely a whisper now. She loved you. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. And you let her die alone. The millionaire's knees nearly buckled. He could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could hear the rapid click of camera phones being unlocked, the sharp intake of breath as the guests realized they were witnessing something rare. The moment a man's sins caught up with him. The girl stood, the locket still open in her palm. "I didn't come here for justice," she said, her voice steady. "I came here because I wanted you to remember her. Just once. The way she deserved to be remembered." And then she did the one thing no one expected. She turned and walked away. Not running, not crying, just leaving, like she had already won. The millionaire's lawyer made a move to stop her, but the millionaire grabbed his arm. "Let her go," he said, his voice raw. The guests erupted into chaos, whispers, gasps, the frantic tapping of fingers on screens as they rushed to capture the moment, to be the first to spread the story. But the millionaire didn't see any of them. He was still staring at the locket on the floor, at the proof of a life he had erased. And then, from the back of the room, a single question cut through the noise like a knife. What do you do when the one person you wronged is the one person who still believed in you? The millionaire didn't have an answer, but the girl did. And she was already gone. The millionaire stood frozen, the locket still glinting on the marble floor like a grenade pin pulled but not yet exploded. The room was a storm of whispers, camera flashes, the sharp inhale of scandalized breath, yet he heard none of it. Because the girl had left something behind. Not just the locket, not just the notebook. She had left him with the one thing he had spent a fortune trying to outrun, himself. His lawyer was still hissing in his ear, but the words were static now. "We need to contain this. Now. Before it hits the press." The millionaire barely registered him. His eyes were locked on the locket, on the faded photograph of a woman who had once looked at him like he was worth something more than his bank balance. A woman who had trusted him. A woman he had betrayed without a second thought. And then, movement. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as a figure pushed through, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. The millionaire's oldest friend, his most trusted advisor. The man who had been in the room the night the housekeeper was fired. The man who had whispered, "She's a liability, cut her loose." He stopped in front of the millionaire, his expression unreadable. "You need to fix this," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Now, before she talks to the press." The millionaire didn't answer. He was still staring at the locket. His friend followed his gaze, then cursed under his breath. "That girl is a problem," he snapped. "A problem you created. And if you don't handle it, she's going to burn everything you've built to the ground." The millionaire's jaw tightened. "She's not the problem," he said, his voice rough. "I am." His friend let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, spare me the guilt. You think this is about morality? This is about survival. Your empire doesn't care if you're a saint or a sinner. It only cares if you're strong. And right now, you look weak." The word hit like a slap. Weak. The one thing the millionaire had sworn he would never be. The one thing his father had beaten into him. Never show weakness. Never let them see you bleed. And yet, here he was, bleeding out in front of everyone who mattered. His friend leaned in, his voice a venomous whisper. "You want to fix this? Fine. You call her back. You offer her money, a lot of it. Enough to make her disappear. And if that doesn't work?" His eyes flicked to the security guards by the door. "Then you make sure she understands the consequences of crossing you." The millionaire's stomach twisted. He had done it before, crushed people who got in his way. But this wasn't just some business rival. This was a child, A child who had just handed him the one thing he had spent a lifetime pretending he didn't need. A mirror. He turned away from his friend, his gaze sweeping over the room. The guests were watching him now, their expressions a mix of hunger and disgust. They had come for a party, but they were staying for the show, the fall of a titan, the unraveling of a king. And then he saw her. Not the girl. The woman standing near the back, her arms crossed, her eyes locked onto him with the intensity that made his skin prickle. The journalist, the one who had been digging into his past for months, the one who had nearly exposed him once before. She was smiling now, a slow, predatory smile, as she typed furiously on her phone. His friend followed his gaze and cursed. "She's already tweeting about this. You have minutes before this goes viral." The millionaire's mind raced. He could do what he always did. Fight, bury, destroy. He could unleash his lawyers, his PR team, his army of fixers. He could turn the girl into the villain, twist the story, make sure no one believed her. But for the first time, the thought made him sick. Because the girl hadn't come here for money. She hadn't come here for revenge. She had come here for him, to make him see, and God help him, she had. His friend grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. Decide, now. The millionaire looked down at the locket again, at the woman in the photograph, at the man he used to be. And then he made his choice. He turned to his security team, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Find her," he said. "Bring her back, now." His friend exhaled in relief. "Smart man. We'll handle this quietly. A private settlement." Not for that," the millionaire interrupted, his voice steady. "Bring her back because I need to tell her the truth." The room fell silent. His friend's face darkened. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't the time for confessions." "It's the only time that matters," the millionaire said. And then he walked away. Not toward the exits, not toward his office, but toward the doors that led to the gardens, the same gardens where the girl had disappeared into the night. The guests erupted into chaos behind him, their voices a distant roar. The journalist was already on the phone, her voice sharp with triumph. His friend was shouting orders, trying to salvage what was left of the night. But the millionaire didn't look back. Because for the first time in decades, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. The question was, would the girl still be there when he found her? Or had he already lost his last chance to make things right? The gardens were bathed in the cold glow of the moon, the same moon that had watched over 1,000 lies told within those gilded walls. The millionaire's shoes crunched on the gravel path, each step heavier than the last, his breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts. He had spent a lifetime surrounded by people, yet he had never felt so alone. The music from the party was a distant, mocking echo now, the laughter of his guests a cruel reminder of the man he had been just hours ago, a man who had everything, and yet nothing at all. And then he saw her. The girl was sitting on a stone bench, her small frame curled into itself, her gaze fixed on the dark water of the fountain. She didn't turn as he approached, didn't flinch at the sound of his footsteps. She just sat there, as if she had known all along that he would come. The millionaire stopped a few feet away, his hands clenched at his sides. He had spent decades commanding boardrooms, bending the world to his will with nothing more than a look, a word. But now, faced with this child, he felt like a boy again, small, uncertain, terrified of saying the wrong thing. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice rough, unfamiliar. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. The girl didn't answer. She just kept staring at the water, her reflection rippling in the fountain's surface. He took a step closer. "I didn't know about you, about any of it. If I had—" "You would have done what?" she interrupted, her voice quiet but sharp as a blade. She turned to look at him then, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. Not with tears, but with something far worse. Disappointment. Given her more money? A better job? A chance? She let out a humorless laugh. "You had 1,000 chances. And you chose none of them." The millionaire's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to tell her she didn't understand how the world worked, but the excuses died on his lips. because she did understand, better than he ever had. He sat down on the bench beside her, the weight of his failures pressing down on him like a physical force. "I was wrong," he said simply. The words were inadequate, pathetic, but they were all he had. The girl didn't respond. She just stared back at the fountain, her small hands gripping the edge of the bench. "I built an empire," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought that was enough. I thought if I had enough money, enough power, I could outrun the past. But you can't, can you?" He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in his life. "You can't outrun the people you've hurt." The girl's fingers twitched, just slightly. "No," she said finally. "You can't." The millionaire exhaled, the sound shaky, broken. "I don't know how to fix this." She turned to face him then, her expression unreadable. "You can't." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Then what do I do?" For a long moment she didn't answer. She just studied him, her gaze searching his face for something, anything worth salvaging. And then slowly she reached into her pocket. The millionaire tensed, expecting the notebook, the letter, another blow. But what she pulled out was neither. It was a small folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased from being held too tightly. "She wrote this the night she was fired," the girl said, pressing it into his hands. "She never sent it. She said you wouldn't read it anyway." The millionaire unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. It was the same handwriting that had once filled his ledgers, his schedules, his life. The ink was smudged in places, as if tears had fallen on the page. "I know you think I'm just another employee, just another number. But I thought we were more than that. I thought for a little while you saw me the way I saw you, not as a boss, not as a millionaire, but as a person. I was wrong, and that's on me. But I hope one day you realize that the things you can't buy are the things that matter most. Like kindness, like loyalty, like love. I hope you find those things someday. Because money can't keep you warm at night, and it sure as hell can't save your soul." The millionaire's vision blurred. He had spent his life chasing wealth, power, control, only to realize, too late, that he had lost the one thing he could never get back. Her. The girl stood abruptly, her small frame casting a long shadow in the moonlight. "I'm not going to forgive you," she said, her voice steady. "Not tonight, maybe not ever. But I'm done hating you too." She took a step back, then another. "That's all I came here for, to let you know that she deserved better, and so do I." The millionaire didn't try to stop her. He just sat there, the letter clutched in his hands, the weight of his mistakes crushing him. She turned to leave, her footsteps fading into the darkness, and then she paused. "My name is Clara," she said without looking back, "in case you ever want to know." And then she was gone. The millionaire stayed on that bench for a long time. The party raged on inside, the music and laughter a cruel mockery of the man he had become. But out here, in the quiet, he finally understood the truth. He wasn't just a villain in someone else's story. He was the villain in his own. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his pocket like a sacred relic. And for the first time in decades, he let himself feel the one thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding: grief. Now it's your turn. If you could say one thing to the millionaire right now, one piece of advice, one hard truth, one question, what would it be? Drop it in the comments below, because some stories aren't just about the characters, they're about us, and what we'd do if we were in their shoes.